Urgent! Ukraine has succeeded. NATO gives a standing ovation. Zelensky's triumph in Ankara. A fateful defense agreement. 9 billion euros in aid. But that's not all. A powerful tech alliance with Ukraine. And what's more, the turning point in the war has already happened. The alliance has officially stated that Russia is on the defensive and the Ukrainian armed forces have a golden window to completely defeat the Kremlin. Moreover, Rutte harshly confronted the Russians live on air and urged them to flee the army. Furthermore, Trump addressed Kyiv. The US president's team is now fully on Ukraine's side, even trying to make up for lost ground in the field of Ukrainian technologies. All the details right now. Hello, my name is Andrei Silakov. This is the channel Ukraine Today and the latest news. The turning point in the war, which experts have debated for so long, has now been officially recognized at the highest international level. At the NATO summit in Ankara, high-ranking alliance officials openly stated Ukraine's defense forces have completely seized the initiative, regained more territory than they lost, and have forced the Kremlin's army onto the defensive. A senior alliance official told journalists about this.
The fact is that at this moment, Ukraine has actually regained more territory than it has lost. These are significant successes on the front line. They managed to strike deep into enemy territory and send a very strong signal. And Russia essentially is on the defensive, she stated.
According to Western estimates, the Ukrainian armed forces now have a golden window of opportunity, 6 to 9 months, to make the most of this historic turning point and deliver a final defeat to Russia. For now, the enemy is in a panic, trying to adapt to the deep strikes by Ukrainian forces.
However, the official noted that NATO understands Russia is quick to learn from its mistakes. Russia learns just as quickly as the alliance does. Therefore, part of this 6 to 9 month period is about understanding how quickly Russia needs to adapt its tactical and technical capabilities, she said.
The main triumph for Ukraine at the summit was the large-scale, fateful defense agreements that Vladimir Zelensky concluded with key European leaders. Within the unique drone dialogue format, Kyiv secured unprecedented contracts. The Dutch government has officially committed to providing Ukraine with massive military support totaling 9 billion euros through 2029.
As Zelensky reported, the document provides for cooperation in the areas of security, defense industry, military expertise, cybersecurity, research and development technologies, as well as the exchange of experience.
Following Amsterdam, Estonia and Denmark joined the crucial tech alliance with Ukraine. The agreements with Tallinn initiate the rapid deployment of new capacities for the production of air defense systems, ammunition, early warning sensor systems, and naval forces directly on the territory of the two countries. Denmark has already signed its 9th historic contract, gaining official access to Ukrainian weapon exports that have been proven in real combat. Germany, Canada, and Norway are next in line.
This agreement is not only a path toward closer cooperation between our countries, it is also a step and a signal of trust. After all, we are signing such an agreement with a very close friend, and that means a great deal. Of course, we are also always grateful for your strong support, both military and humanitarian, as well as for your efforts aimed at consistently supporting Ukraine on our path to the EU and NATO.
Against this backdrop, even the Trump administration in Washington has been forced to finally take Ukraine's side. The American military is well aware that the United States is currently lagging behind in the field of unmanned systems. The Pentagon is trying to catch up and adopt Ukraine's advanced experience, which makes the signing of the final contract with the White House inevitable. Trump is pragmatically betting on strength, and today all technological and military power is concentrated in Kyiv's hands.
Despite the fact that high-ranking Pentagon officials, in particular Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth and Army Secretary Dan Driscoll, have publicly praised Ukraine's drone capabilities, Washington is in no hurry to take advantage of them. As the article notes, this puzzles experts. I don't understand what's stopping us from taking advantage of this. I don't think there are any compelling reasons, said Rebecca Heinrichs, senior fellow at the Hudson Institute think tank. Michael O'Hanlon from the Brookings Institution admitted that the situation simply puzzles him, since the US has already sent its teams to Ukraine for on-site training.
While the Western world gives a standing ovation to Ukraine's tremendous successes, NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte directly addressed the citizens of the aggressor country with a tough call to use their brains and stay away from military enlistment offices.
Putin is ready to sacrifice his own citizens for the sake of war. Remember, you could become one of the 30,000 people this month or next who will die. Your president, Vladimir Putin, is ready to sacrifice you, so think carefully before joining the army.
The result of this diplomatic and military breakthrough is obvious. Kyiv is building a strategic network of defense giants with the wealthiest countries on the planet. And while the Kremlin desperately paints paper victories, reality is turning into a real nightmare for Moscow. The Ukrainian armed forces are reclaiming territories, the occupiers' logistics are falling apart under devastating drone strikes, and the Black Sea has become a zone of fear for the remnants of Putin's fleet. Even America openly acknowledges the complete exhaustion of the Russian offensive. How is Ukraine step by step taking away the Kremlin's main military advantages? And why was this past June an absolute disaster for Putin? Let's break it down right now.
While Russian propaganda paints yet another picture of victory, the Ukrainian armed forces quietly, without much noise, have caused a real collapse of the front for the occupiers. In one sector, Ukrainian forces regained control over dozens of square kilometers of territory in just a month and a half, areas that had been considered Russian rear for over a year. And the most interesting part is, the Russians are trying to hide such a painful failure at any cost. According to preliminary estimates, we're talking about at least 50 square kilometers of liberated land, and some hints from analysts suggest the numbers could be even higher. To put it in perspective, if this data is confirmed for the first time in a long while, Ukraine could end the month with a positive balance of liberated territories. And this is already a serious signal to everyone who was quick to write off Ukraine's offensive potential. The enemy's reaction is especially telling. Throughout June, the Russian side published only a few videos from this area, and even those actually showed not the successes of the occupiers, but the advance of Ukrainian forces. When an army that usually films every meter of its movement suddenly goes silent, it often means only one thing: there's really nothing to report there. It seems Ukrainian drones have turned part of the front into a real zone of terror for the occupiers. Russia was forced to bombard its own former positions with dozens of guided aerial bombs, trying to stop the advance of the Ukrainian armed forces. But even that didn't help. What was recently considered a Russian bridgehead is gradually coming under the control of Ukrainian forces. And here there is another very important detail. The offensive began with the use of armored vehicles, which, contrary to the predictions of many experts, are far from obsolete. Combined with the mass use of drones, this allowed them to break through and minimize losses. In fact, Ukrainian forces are demonstrating a new formula for an offensive, where drones not only assist the troops, but actually pave the way for them through the most dangerous sections of the front. And that's not all. In just 1 month, Ukraine's defense forces struck more than 200,000 enemy targets, and behind each of these numbers, destroyed equipment, demolished depots, burned supply routes, and yet another blow to Russia's ability to continue the war. The most painful result for the occupiers is that nearly 28,000 Russian soldiers were either eliminated or received such severe wounds that they were put out of action. In fact, June became one of the most difficult months for the Russian army in recent times. And importantly, Ukrainian strikes are increasingly reaching the enemy far beyond the front line, in places where they recently still felt relatively safe. The Minister of Defense reported that the number of targets hit at a distance of more than 50 kilometers from the line of contact has almost doubled. In other words, Ukrainian drones and precision strike systems are penetrating ever deeper into the Russian rear. And this means that for the occupiers, the war no longer ends at the first line of defense. There is a particular focus on logistics. It is logistics that is being hit with the most painful strikes today. It seems that Ukrainian UAV operators have launched a real hunt for anything moving toward the front. Trucks, fuel tankers, motorcycles, ammunition depots. All of these are increasingly turning into smoke before they even reach Russian positions. June has become a record-breaking month for the defense forces. Ukrainian forces set a record for destroying Russian artillery, achieved their best results since the start of the full-scale war in intercepting enemy drones, nearly 50,000 units, and also broke the absolute record for destroying the occupiers' vehicles and motorcycles. And most importantly, these are no longer just isolated successful operations, but a systematic campaign to exhaust the enemy. Ukrainian drones are methodically tightening the noose around the occupiers' logistics day after day. And it seems that this is exactly what Moscow fears the most. After all, the front can be reinforced with new soldiers, but restoring a destroyed supply system under constant fire from Ukrainian drones is much more difficult. That is why June may turn out to be not just a record month of losses for Russia, but the beginning of much more serious problems ahead. And while the Ukrainian armed forces are reclaiming their land meter by meter, it seems that the Kremlin has decided to take their favorite approach, simply drawing themselves a victory. After another round of successes by Ukrainian forces at the front, Putin's press secretary Dmitry Peskov suddenly started talking about major achievements by the Russian army and the inevitable fulfillment of all the war's objectives. However, there is one problem. Reality once again forgot to coordinate its plans with Kremlin propaganda. While Russians were being told on the radio about a successful offensive, independent analysts carefully studied the maps that Russian generals showed to Putin. And it turned out that there is a gap of almost 2,000 square kilometers between the front lines and the Kremlin's reports. In other words, if the Ukrainian armed forces are liberating territories in the real world, the Russian general staff compensates for this by capturing territories in a world of fantasy. The funniest part is not even the scale of these fabrications, but their content. On the paper maps prepared for Putin, the Russian army has almost reached Sloviansk, and Kramatorsk supposedly has full control over Chasiv Yar, is advancing toward Dobropilya, and in some places is nearly approaching Zaporizhzhia. It gives the impression that the Kremlin's master is being shown not military reports, but a trailer for yet another science fiction movie. It is precisely here that it becomes clear why Moscow speaks so confidently about its successes. If you look at maps every day where the army advances faster than common sense, you can start to believe any fairy tale. The only problem is that the real front exists outside the Kremlin offices. And there, Russian troops are increasingly confronted not by drawn arrows, but by Ukrainian drones, artillery, and counterattacks. But the most painful blow for the Kremlin, it seems, did not happen on land, but at sea. On Navy Day, Vladimir Zelensky stated directly, "Russia has lost the Black Sea." Just a few years ago, such a statement would have seemed like science fiction. A country without a large navy forced one of the world's largest naval fleets to retreat. After the liberation of Snake Island and a series of strikes on ships, headquarters, bases, and ports, the occupiers have effectively lost the ability to feel like masters of the waters. Today, the Black Sea has become yet another example of how Ukrainian technology and unconventional solutions are breaking Russian military patterns. Naval drones have accomplished what was considered nearly impossible until recently. They forced the Russian Black Sea fleet to shift from a show of strength to a mode of constant survival. And now, Russian ships increasingly resemble not hunters, but prey, constantly looking over their shoulders. It seems this is only the beginning of much bigger problems for Moscow. After all, if the Black Sea is no longer safe for Russian ships, then the Black Sea and Azov regions can no longer be considered a rear area. And while the Kremlin continues to boast about its successes, Ukraine is step by step taking away from the enemy what it once considered its undeniable advantage.
Meanwhile, occupied Crimea is plunging into its most massive nightmare since the beginning of the war. Reality on the peninsula hits hard. Panic-stricken fear, secret orders from the security forces, and completely paralyzed logistics. Has Moscow begun preparing an emergency plan to retreat from Crimea? Find out in our report.
Crimea, time to leave. Very alarming forecasts have suddenly begun to appear in the occupation administrations of the peninsula. According to underground sources, officials in Kerch and Feodosia received an urgent order to remove the most valuable documents, archives, and equipment by a certain date. Russia was planning to stay on the peninsula forever. So why the rush to pack up folders, servers, and official equipment? The most interesting thing is that after this order appeared, a real epidemic of strange illnesses broke out among certain officials. People who just yesterday were actively running the occupation structures suddenly started taking sick leave, going on vacation, and leaving Crimea, and not just anywhere far away, but specifically toward the Krasnodar region. All of this is very reminiscent of a familiar scenario. First, the authorities talk about having full control over the situation, then they switch their headquarters to round-the-clock operations, after which they start removing documents and looking for backup escape routes. And then it usually turns out that the situation is not as stable as they claimed on television. These events look especially tense against the backdrop of regular strikes on military targets in Crimea. It seems that even the local collaborators no longer have much faith in the supposedly all-powerful Russian air defense. After a series of Ukrainian strikes on logistics in the south, Russia has faced a new problem. Delivering cargo to the occupied peninsula has not only become difficult, it has become extremely expensive. According to journalists, transporting cargo to Crimea already costs several times more than covering a similar distance within Russia itself. But for the occupiers, the worst part isn't even the prices, but the mood of the carriers. More and more drivers are simply refusing to travel the Crimean routes. Some companies are reducing the number of trips, while others are shutting down this route altogether. The reason is simple. Everyone wants to make money, but fewer and fewer are willing to become the next target along the way. Meanwhile, as Crimean officials pack up their documents, Russian military forces have suddenly started rehearsing a very interesting scenario. According to the exercise scenario, Russian troops were preparing for a landing of Ukrainian forces in Crimea. Moreover, the scenario was so serious that, on the maps, Ukrainian forces were advancing from several directions across the Black Sea at once. They actively used naval drones, UAVs, long-range weapons, and modern reconnaissance systems. In other words, the occupiers were modeling exactly the kind of development that, until recently, Russian propaganda had called completely unrealistic. Notably, in these exercises, the Russian command posts acted mainly from a defensive position. They did not plan a new offensive, did not draw arrows toward Odessa or Mykolaiv, and did not prepare for another push to the west. Instead, they built defensive lines around Sevastopol, Kerch, and northern Crimea. It seems that in the Kremlin, they are increasingly thinking not about how to seize new territories, but about how to hold on to what is still under their control. And while Russian military forces are repelling imaginary Ukrainian landings on their maps, reality is presenting them with a very real problem. The electricity is disappearing. After strikes on key substations, part of the occupied Crimea was suddenly plunged into darkness. Entire districts of the peninsula were left without power. Important nodes of the power system, which supply a significant part of the peninsula, were hit. As a result, problems arose simultaneously in several cities and districts. And this once again demonstrates the main weakness of the occupation model. Crimea appears stable only as long as its infrastructure operates without interruption. If just a few key elements are taken out of operation, the entire system starts to fail. Most interestingly, the problems were not limited to electricity. Along with it, the internet also began to disappear. Local residents report disruptions in the operation of services, stores, and order pickup points. And while Kremlin officials talk about the full integration of Crimea into Russia, the peninsula increasingly resembles a remote outpost living in a state of constant emergencies and restrictions. All the recent events suddenly come together into a single picture. First, there were strikes on logistics and a sharp increase in transportation costs to the peninsula, then orders to evacuate documents from the occupation administrations. Then the headquarters were switched to an enhanced mode of operation, and now there are also drills to repel a Ukrainian landing. If you look at all this separately, you might call it a coincidence. But when there are too many such coincidences, they start to look like preparations for a very specific scenario. It seems that Moscow's greatest fear today is not only related to strikes on military targets. The main threat for the Kremlin is the prospect that Crimea is gradually losing its connection to Russian logistics and will turn into an isolated bridgehead that will have to be held at any cost. And history knows many examples when such territories sooner or later became not a symbol of strength, but a source of constant problems. And while Moscow continues to repeat the mantra about Crimea being Russian forever, more and more signs are appearing on the peninsula itself that it is beginning to turn into a suitcase without a handle for the Kremlin, too heavy to carry, too frightening to abandon, but pretending that nothing is happening is becoming increasingly difficult.
And what do you think about these events? Write your thoughts in the comments, leave a like, and stay informed about the most important news. There's more to come.